Hello. Here we are once again. This is our last time that we're going to be together for Acts because we're going to do the last two chapters. You see that we are now in chapters 27 and 28 of Acts, Anchors Away and Built Relationships in Rome. But let us go through all the other chapters and see if, I can do this. Actually, I haven't given Haley her cheat sheet since she probably doesn't know all these. Okay, here we go. Ascension, beginning of the church. C, cripple cured. D, disciples detained. E, each lied, each died. E, F, faithful, 7 chosen. F, G, gospel preached by Stephen. H, here is water. I, in Damascus. J, Joppa vision. K, kingdom includes Gentiles. K, L is liberated Peter. L, M, missionary journey number 1. M, N, not gods but men. N, O, old law not binding. O, P, Paul, called to Macedonia. Q, questions answered. R, remains in Corinth 3 months. Is it 3 months or 18 months? 18 months, sorry. Okay, stays in Corinth for 3 years. And Ephesus. So, okay. Remains in Corinth for 18 months and then stays in Ephesus for 3 years. ST, not Tarsus, but Troas on Sunday. T, U, uprising in Jerusalem. U, V, valiant defense by Paul. V, W, wishes Paul dead, or wants Paul dead, wanted Paul dead. Is it wanted or?
Wished Paul dead.
Wished Paul dead. W, X, excuse of Felix. X, Y, yet untried. Z, zealous before Agrippa. A, again, is anchors away. And then B is built relationships in Rome. So, just had to have a little help there. So, all right, very good. Now, let us go on to our chapter 27, Anchors Away. This is said to be the most exciting chapter in the whole New Testament because of this all the stuff that happens with the ship. And so I, of course, have done quite a bit of research, nautical research this time, so hopefully I can help you understand what exactly was going on with Paul and all of the 276 people that were on board that ship. Okay, now we're going to do a review about the last few chapters. All right, Paul now has been in prison for 2 years. His imprisonment was no surprise. He had been compelled by the Holy Spirit, remember, to go to Jerusalem. He was warned about prison and hardships. You remember the prophet Agabus. He gave a dramatic prophecy that dramatically told him what would happen to him in Jerusalem. Then he was arrested. There was an uprising in Jerusalem, chapter 21. Paul made a valiant defense in chapter 22, but the Jews wanted him dead. God comforted Paul, you remember, in a vision, and he let him know that his prayers were answered. He is going to go to Rome, and he wanted him to take courage. He let him know that God was in control of the situation, of everything that's happening to Paul. Now, the commander, Claudius Lysias, had learned of this Jewish plot, remember, to kill Paul. And he took Paul out of harm's way, sent him to Caesarea, where Felix was governor at the time. Felix heard the accusations of the Jews, was not impressed. He did not find that Paul was guilty of any of death, much less imprisonment, but he wanted to do the Jews a favor, and so he kept Paul in prison for 2 years. Last week, Porcius Festus had replaced the governor Felix, but he too wanted to build a good relationship with the Jews. So he had inherited this prisoner of Paul. He tried to investigate the matter, but it was the same thing over and over again, that the Jews could not prove their accusations against Paul. So finally, Paul appealed to Caesar. And this is where we are right now. All right, so let's move on. I will tell you just at the outset, these are not the maps that I was going to use, because our technology was not working very well with those. So it may be a little jumbled on here at times, but I think that this map is just going to work fine. All right, verse number 1, when it was decided that we would sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. Okay, now this, you see I'm sorry, I have to go all the way back here. All right, you see this, well, what is this called? It's a peninsula, sorry. You see this peninsula. It hasn't always been called Italy, but in the 1st century, it did start becoming called Italia or Italy during the reign of Augustus Caesar. Now, this centurion named Julius, he was in charge of the prisoners, and he belonged to the imperial regiment. Now, I don't know what he was doing there. The imperial regiment was based in Rome. So he may have had to go to Caesarea on other business, and was just bringing these prisoners back because he happened to be there and was going back to Rome. He could have been sent specifically to get them and take them to Rome. We just don't really know. All right, verse number 2. We boarded a ship from Adramyttium about to sail for ports along the coast of the province of Asia. Now, first of all, it says we boarded a ship. Now, we have not seen this possessive pronoun, we, since chapter 21. That does not mean that Luke has not been in the same place as Paul. It just means that from 21 on, he was explaining things that were happening to Paul, and he was not included in those happenings. But now he is. He is going on this trip with Paul. Now, it says they boarded a ship from Adramyttium. Now, Adramyttium is, let's see, Adramyttium is up here. It's let's see, right around up here. Okay. And then, but Adramyttium is a little ways from Caesarea, and here we are at Caesarea. So, it was going to sail for the ports up here around Asia. So it was, so their preferred way to go would have been from Caesarea and go on this direction up to the region of Asia. But that's not what happened. All right, continuing on with verse 2. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. All right, remember last week we saw this, an ancient port ruin. This is in Caesarea. And we talked about how Paul might have actually gone down these steps. We don't know, but I wanted to remind you of that. All right. Verse 3, the next day we landed at Sidon. Now, Sidon is right here. And Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so they might provide for his needs. Evidently, even though he was a prisoner, Paul was allowed some leniency by Julius. All right, verse 4. From there we put out to sea again and passed to the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. Okay, now remember I said that they would normally have gone just across this way, but because the winds were against them, they were having to go to the lee side of Cyprus. Now the lee side is right here. Right there. And the lee side is always the calm side of an island or body of land. So they are going right along here. You can see where the red line is, and they'll be passing here and here. All right. Verse 5. When we had sailed across the open sea off the coast of Cilicia, which is up here, and Pamphylia, which is right up there as well, we landed in Myra in Lycia. All right, here's Myra, right here. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. All right, now, by this time, they wanted to be much farther along than they were. Now it's probably taken them 10 to 15 days to get from here to here. Now it says that the centurion found an Alexandrian ship. And now down here, this is Alexandria, and this is Egypt. Alexandria is in Egypt. This was the largest ship that sailed the seas at that time, the Alexandrian ships, is because they carried cargoes of grain. Egypt was at that time known as the granary of Italy. So let's take a little bit of a look. They changed ships in Myra, but I wanted to show you a drawing of an Alexandrian ship. All right. Now this was from the 3rd century, but it didn't change probably very much from the 1st century. The usual cargo capacity was 10 modii, or 86 tons. 86 tons! That's a lot of grain. Okay, so the length can have been 25 meters, which is about 27 and a half yards, somewhere around there. And the beam, which is the width, was 6.5 meters, which is around, it's over 7 yards. Okay, so I wanted to be able to show you what that might look like. Like how big was this ship? So I have, I know some of you are not from Shiloh, but a lot of you are. And this is, can you see this, Haley? Okay. This is a drawing of the inside of Shiloh. Now, when you come in from this direction, you come in these front doors, and then you go through these second doors. Okay, from the second door, this is how long this ship is. From the second door here, all the way back to here. Now this is where the bathrooms are. This is where one of the glass doors to the outside is, right there where that little playground is. All right, so it was that long, and it was about this wide, the width of this part of the foyer. Now I was trying to get to also give you another idea of how it was, and so I wanted to let you know, like if you were standing at the back of the auditorium looking up here to the front, it would be about as long as from here to about here. And it would be about this wide. So it was quite large. So the next time you're at Shiloh and you walk in, now you can see how big that ship was. Also, now this is the mainsail right here. This is the topsail, and this was huge. This was 140 square meters, just huge. Now these are the rudders. Remember what a rudder is. A rudder steers the ship, and we are going to be talking about the rudders just briefly at the very end of the chapter. So these are the rudders. There's one on each side, and they are pulled up with lanyards whenever they need to bring them up. Okay, as you can see right here, this is the lifeboat. And you see this drawn right here? This is where the water line is. The water line is here, and this is where the draft would be. Is that part of the ship is in the water. Same thing right here. Now, this is the bow of the ship, which is the front of the ship. And this would be the stern of the ship. Okay, so I believe, no. Yeah. Actually, I have no clue because I thought this was the bow, but I don't know what the topsail would be doing over here if this was the bow. So, no, you're right. Okay, this is the stern back here because of the rudders, and here is the lifeboat. Now, I believe in Luke's account, though, we find that the lifeboat was in the bow. So remember that. Okay, and there we go. The rudders could be hoisted from the water with lanyards when required. This was done, for instance, when the ship was running before a gale, a bad storm, as described in Luke's account of Paul's journey to Rome. Okay, after I've thoroughly confused you, we are going to go on. All right. Where was I? All right. He found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. We made slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off of Cnidus. Now, this is Cnidus right here. They couldn't get there. They had difficulty. When the wind did not allow us to hold our course, it was very blustery, we sailed to the lee, remember what the lee is, the lee of Crete, opposite Salmone, right here. And, all right, I've got a bigger picture of this for you. So they came this direction here. This is the Cape of Salmone, and they're going to the lee right here. And they will be traveling this direction until they get to Fair Havens. Okay, when the wind did not allow us to hold our course, we sailed to the lee of Crete, opposite Salmone. We moved along the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Havens near the town of Lasea. Much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous because now it was after the Day of Atonement. Okay, after the Day of Atonement. What was significant about that? The Day of Atonement is the latter part of September or early October. Now, in 2020, for instance, it falls on September 27th. So the Day of Atonement starts at sunset of the 27th and it ends sunset of the 28th. All right. Romans considered sailing after September 15th real iffy. After November 11th, it was considered suicidal. So they would not be able to sail again until March 10th. So that made a difference in the decision that they are about to make because they didn't want to wait that long. All right. So Paul warned them, "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo, and to our own lives also." Evidently, they had a conference, a little conference on board the ship with some people who knew about shipping being there, and evidently they felt Paul knew enough to put in his 2 cents at this conference. So they all these men had experience in sailing. So Paul advises that the ship should winter in Fair Havens. But the ship, the decision was made to go to Phoenix. Now, let's see. I want to show you where. All right. We'll weigh anchor in just a minute, but I wanted to show you where Phoenix is. So this is Fairhaven, and all they needed to do is just get right up here to Phoenix. It doesn't look like it's that far. All right, so sorry. All right, but the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and of the owner of the ship. Interesting that the centurion evidently has the last say in the matter. But the pilot of the ship, which is the captain, and the owner of the ship, they really wanted to go on. They didn't want to wait because they knew they were going to have to winter until March the 10th at least. So they had an economic reason for wanting to just go ahead and go. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, and I don't know why it was unsuitable, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbor in Crete facing both southwest and northwest. To me, this doesn't look like it's facing northwest at all, but so I don't know if maybe Phoenix at that time was over here, but that's really neither here nor there. Verse 13, when a gentle south wind began to blow, they thought they saw their opportunity, so they weighed anchor, pulled up that anchor, and sailed along the shore of Crete. So here we are, we're sailing along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force called the nor'easter swept down from the island. Now in the Pacific, that would be called a typhoon. In the Atlantic, it would be called a hurricane. So now, because of this decision, everybody on board is in jeopardy. Their lives are in jeopardy. So it seems that the captain, the centurion, the owner had made a mistake. But you have to make a decision based on the information that you had at the time. However, it seems that because it was more economic, that they are putting everybody's life in jeopardy. All right, verse 15, the ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind, so we gave way to it and were driven along. As we passed to the lee of a small island called Cauda, right here, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure. So the men had hoisted it aboard. Then they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together. Now this is called undergirding the ship. The ancients, I'm just going to read a little something here. The ancients were accustomed to pass cables or strong ropes around a vessel to keep the planks from springing by the action of the sea. This is now called frapping a vessel. The operation of frapping a vessel is described in Falconer's Marine Dictionary. To frap a ship is to pass 4 or 5 turns of a large cable-laid rope around the hull or frame of a ship to support her in a great storm or otherwise when it is seen that she is not strong enough to resist the violent efforts of the sea. So here they are. They are on the lee side of Cauda, and they are doing some things that they had not been able to do over here. Over here, the winds were just horrific. But they are on the lee side for just a little while. And so they're trying to get some things done to take care of the ship. So they pull that lifeboat up because it says they were hardly able to make it secure. They pass those ropes under the ship, which is undergirding the ship. Another thing, because they were afraid they would run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis, they lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. All right, so let's see. Here are the sandbars of Sirta. These were dangerous. And I'm going to read you something else that I found out about these sandbars of Syrtis. There were two Syrtis, or they're also known as quicksands, off the coast of Africa. They're called the Greater and the Lesser Syrtis. They were vast beds of sand driven up by the sea and constantly shifting their position because of fearsome cross currents, the currents in the sea, so that it could not be known for certain where the danger was. So they could not map a course through these sands because they changed all the time. Once caught inside, a ship is either destroyed on the rocks or marooned on a sandbar miles and miles from shore. The ship taking Paul to Rome was one of the largest of its day and carried a heavy load of grain. If the ship was caught in the quicksands of Syrtis, death was inevitable to every person on board. The sailors had good reason to fear. With such a deep draft due to the heavy cargo of grain, they would easily have gotten grounded on a sandbar in the middle of nowhere, many miles from the shoreline. I mean, we're talking maybe 20 miles from the shore. And they wouldn't be able to lower a dinghy and move out in there. But if a man, you couldn't swim it, it was like quicksand. So the old sailor's axiom would hold true. Water, water everywhere, but not a drop to drink. They would have had plenty of grain on board, so plenty to eat, but no water. They were looking at a slow and painful death by dehydration. So, not wanting to go there. So what they did, let's read on. They lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. Now, some versions said they straked sail, which means they lowered the mast, or they took down the mast. Some masts, they have something where they can lower the mast the length of the ship, or they would just cut it off if they had to. But the New International Version says they lowered the sea anchor. Let's see if we can. Yeah, they lowered the sea anchor. Now I wanted you to see a picture of a sea anchor. This right here is a sea anchor. All right, it looks like a parachute. All right, what is a sea anchor? It's designed to stop the drift of a boat in open water. Sea anchors are usually deployed from the bow of the ship, that's the front of the ship. They are often shaped like large parachutes. If the ship was headed for a lee shore and not responding to controls because of mechanical failure or stormy conditions at sea, a sea anchor would arrest the boat, stop the boat, as it drastically slows the drift due to the winds and the waves. All right. I'm still not really sure how that works, but evidently it is very handy to have if you're in this type of situation. Okay, continuing on. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. Now, the cargo was probably the grain. Okay, if they had 80 tons of cargo, it's going to take a while for them to get it all off. But they were throwing out as much cargo as they possibly could to lighten that ship. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. Now, the tackle is any equipment they might have on board, any furniture. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. Now, this is Luke talking. We finally gave up all hope. Was he talking about himself and Paul as well? It looks like it. I mean, they were exhausted through this whole thing. They were lost. They had no stars, no sun to navigate by. So we can learn some lessons from storms. One, the innocent often suffer because of the actions of others. The captain, the centurion, the pilot, or the owner had made the wrong decision. Everyone on the ship, the sailors, the soldiers, the prisoners, the passengers, people like Luke and Paul and Aristarchus, they all suffered. In our world today, the devil prowls around like a raging lion seeking someone to devour. 1 Peter 5, verse 8. And in his wake, the innocent suffer. Children with child abuse, spousal abuse, broken homes, personality conflicts, human injustices, sex trafficking. From Adam till the 21st century, from the cradle to the grave, the suffering of the innocent has been part of life. But sometimes we find ourselves in storms of our own making because of our own impatience, because we refuse to take good advice, or we take advice from the wrong source. Sometimes we put our trust in only what we can see, and not from the one above. Okay, but back to our story. One person remained calm, and it's because of a vision that he had. Yet another vision. Verse 21, after they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, "Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. I told you so." He's saying, I told you so. Then you would have spared yourself this damage and loss. And he's going to go on to say, now you should have listened to me. So listen to me now. Okay, so listen to me now. Verse 22, but now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. So he's bringing them hope. And this is how he's bringing them up. He's telling them about his vision. Last night, an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me and said, "Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island." So when Paul has been at his wit's end, not just this time, but other times as well, when he starts to lose hope, God sends him a vision. And God sends us people, he sends us encouragers to help us when we seem to have lost all hope, when hope seems to have fled us. Okay. Lesson number 2, even the worst storms cannot hinder the purposes of God. And lesson number 3, storms give us opportunities to serve others. We're in a storm right now. We are in a pandemic. It's a worldwide storm. People are scared. It's a scary thing. We have a reason to be scared. But we can minister to others. It's a good time for us to minister to others. Paul knew how to pray. We know how to pray. He had faith in God. We have faith in God. He was in touch with the Almighty. And through prayer, we are too. He had the answer for the hope that was in him. 1 Peter 3, verse 15. We have the answer too. Lesson number 4. Storms give us the opportunity to bear witness to Christ. And we have such a huge opportunity to do that. So many people now are turning to God that would not ordinarily want him or think they need him. All right, verse 27. On the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea, when about midnight, the sailors sensed they were approaching land. Okay, if you are reading in your Bible, you'll see the Adriatic Sea. They were being driven across the Adriatic Sea. This is the Adriatic Sea right here. All this. All right. Now, I said before they didn't know where they were. They didn't know where they were. So why is Luke saying they were being driven across the Adriatic Sea? Well, he's writing this after the fact. So, while he's writing it, he knew where they were. But at this point, in the story, they did not know. But the sailors sensed they were approaching land. Sailors, they can just tell. They can tell from the swell of the sea. Verse 28, they took soundings and found that the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later, they took soundings again and found it was 90 feet deep. Now I went and looked I looked up some things on soundings. Did not understand anything. And, if this is something that interests you, go right ahead. But it did not interest me. All I need to know is that the soundings, it was 120 feet deep first, and then it was 90 feet deep, indicating that they were getting close to land. Okay. Now, this is good news. But is it good news? Verse 29, fearing that they would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. Now, do you remember where the stern is? It's at the back of the boat. So they dropped these anchors and prayed for daylight. Now, the King James Version says they wished for daylight. The Greek interlinear, it also translates this word from the Greek to wished. So they are wishing for an opportunity to see their way to safety. Another lesson we learned, storms have a way of revealing character. So they were wishing for this. They were praying for it. Just wishing is not having faith in God's promises. Now, remember, through Paul, God had told them that all 276 of those on the ship were going to be saved. But let's go on and see about the character of some people. Verse 30, in an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea, pretending they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. So, evidently, the lifeboat on this particular Alexandrian ship was in the bow. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved. So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it drift away. Okay, so these sailors were just going to take matters into their own hands and get away. But they were thinking only of themselves, not about anybody else. And then when Paul told the soldiers that their lives were in jeopardy now because if these sailors got away, then the soldiers were all for cutting off the lifeboat and preventing that from happening. All right, so verse 33. Just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. For the last 14 days, he said, you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. After he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. All right. So we need spiritual food to survive the storms of life. That's lesson number 6. We are going through this storm of the pandemic, and we need spiritual food. That's why people are hungering more for spiritual food. Now, they threw the grain into the sea after they'd eaten everything. So there was still grain on board. They just hadn't been able to get it all off. So now they're trying to get as much off as they can. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. All right, so they see the land, they see the beach. Now they are going to prepare for landing. Verse 40, cutting loose the anchors. Let's see. They left them in the sea and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. Remember, I showed you where the rudders were. So now they're untying the rudders so they can lift them down. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach. Okay, they did all this at the same time. So this was a plan that they had. And they did it all at the same time. They had some cutting the anchors, some untying the ropes that held the rudders. So now it was important for them, whenever they cut those anchors loose, that they had some way to steer and that they had something to give them forward momentum, not just the waves. All right, so off the anchors go, the rudders go down so they can steer, and up goes that foresail, and off they go, whoosh, right? They're making for the beach. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. Oh no, oh no. The bow stuck fast and would not move, and the stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. So they've got behind them, the ship was just being torn to pieces, and they had to get off of that ship. All right, the soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them escaping from swimming away and escaping. Now, while the sailors were deciding how to get the ship closer to the beach, the soldiers were evidently planning to kill these prisoners. But the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to get there on planks or on pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land in safety. So, the centurion was the hero of the day. He prevented the soldiers from killing the prisoners. And he had a really good idea about how to get everybody to shore safely. All right. Now, once safely on shore, we found out that the island was called Malta. The islanders showed us unusual kindness. They built a fire and welcomed us all because it was raining and cold. So that was really nice of them. Paul gathered a pile of brushwood, and as he put it on the fire, a viper, driven out by the heat, fastened itself on his hand. So I can just imagine Paul. He's putting this brushwood on this fire, and this viper comes out and grabs his hand, sinking his fangs into Paul's hand. Well, you can imagine, that probably did not feel good for Paul. And I would imagine he yelled, "Ah!" Okay. When the islanders saw the snake hanging from his hand, they said to each other, "Oh, this man must be a murderer. For though he escaped from the sea, the goddess Justice has not allowed him to live." Now, the islanders had superstitious pagan beliefs that they believed in this goddess of justice, and they expected him to fall down dead immediately, but he did not. But Paul shook the snake off into the fire, did not like that snake, and suffered no ill effects. The people expected him to swell up or suddenly fall dead, but after waiting a long time and seeing nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and said he was a god. Oh my. Is it a god? Well, maybe to some. Those of you who don't know who this is my husband, John. And when I saw this picture, I was not happy. This is a real rattlesnake, but I thought I would give you some comic relief today. All right. Now, there was an estate nearby that belonged to Publius, the chief official on the island. He welcomed us to his home and showed us generous hospitality for 3 days. Now, the us probably, undoubtedly means Luke and Paul and Aristarchus, but probably maybe the centurion, the owner of the ship, the captain, and some other people. We don't know. His father was sick in bed, suffering from fever and dysentery. Paul went in to see him, and after prayer, placed his hands on him and healed him. When this had happened, the rest of the sick on the island came there and were cured. They honored us in many ways, and when we were ready to sail, they furnished us with the supplies we needed. So they spent 3 months on Malta. And Paul, I thought about this vision that he had. I thought about all 276 people that were on board this ship with Paul. And, they were able to see how Paul trusted in his God. Paul probably was able to talk with many of them about Jesus and about the God Almighty. Then they were told by Paul that they would all be saved, and sure enough they were. Paul's God saved them. Then they go to Malta and see all this healing going on. I firmly believe that Paul left after being there for 3 months and teaching them. I firmly believe that he left a good church right there in Malta, and that the sailors, the prisoners, the soldiers, all the people that were on the ship, that I highly doubt all of them became Christians, but I would think that some of them at least did. All right, after 3 months, verse 11, we put out to sea in a ship that had wintered in the island. It was an Alexandrian ship. with the figurehead of the twin gods Castor and Pollux. Now when I say it was an Alexandrian ship, you know what kind of ship I'm talking about. So this had the twin gods Castor and Pollux on it. These were considered patrons of sailors, and these gods were supposed to give them favorable winds, especially sailors that had been shipwrecked. So you would know these by their Greek name as Gemini. All right, so verse 12. We put in at Syracuse and stayed there for 3 days. Now, here is Syracuse right here, so they didn't have far to go. From there, we set sail and arrived at, I don't know how to say this, Rhegium. The next day, the south wind came up. That was a good thing. And on the following day, we reached Puteoli, right here. So they went from here to here in 1 day. So it was because of that south wind was pushing them on up there. So finally, some good luck there. All right, we found some brothers and sisters who invited us to spend a week with them. All right, so interesting. This happened a lot whenever you would come in from a ship. This happened on some of Paul's missionary journeys, that he would get off the ship and he would stay with friends for a while. But this is a little different because Paul is now a prisoner. But evidently, Paul is given some allowances. Okay. You see, this I just put up 150 miles. Puteoli is about 150 miles from Rome. Let's finish out verse 14. And so we came to Rome. Verse 15. The brothers and sisters there had heard that we were coming, and they traveled as far as the Forum of Appius and the 3 taverns to meet us. At the sight of these people, Paul thanked God and was encouraged. Imagine the holy kisses exchanged between members of the Church of Christ. Romans 16:16. Give each other a holy kiss. I'm sure it was a thrill for Paul to meet these brethren, and maybe even faces that he was familiar with, like Aquila and Priscilla. I'm going to show you a picture. This is a picture of the Appian Way. These are some tombs a few miles south of the city on the Appian Way, and it's in the area now known as the Catacombs. The Appian Way begins about 33 miles north of Puteoli. And the Forum of Appius that it talks about in verse 15 is about 45 miles from Rome. And the 3 taverns was about 33 miles from Rome. All right, here are tombs. Now, here's another picture of the Appian Way. This is at the southern edge of the city of Rome. This large is a mausoleum. It was built after Paul walked this way. Verse 16. When we got to Rome, Paul was allowed to live by himself with a soldier to guard him. Now, we're going to find out in verse 30 that Paul was allowed to rent his own house for 2 years. So, verse 17, 3 days later, he called together the local Jewish leaders. When they had assembled, Paul said to them, "My brothers, although I have done nothing against our people or against the customs of our ancestors, I was arrested in Jerusalem and handed over to the Romans. They examined me and wanted to release me because I was not guilty of any crime deserving death. The Jews objected, so I was compelled to make an appeal to Caesar. I certainly did not intend to bring any charge against my own people. For this reason, I have asked to see you and talk with you. It is because of the hope of Israel that I am bound with this chain. All right, now it was only 3 days later, after he got to Rome, that he called this meeting of the Jewish leaders. So this was pretty much his first order of business whenever he got there. And he wanted to explain to them why he was in Rome. He wanted to give them an opportunity to make charges against him too. He needed to find out what the lay of the land was there in Rome with the Jews. Also, it's possible, that he could expect some Jews from Jerusalem to arrive soon and get the Jews from Rome all riled up. So Paul wants to just put it all before them right now. And he wants them to know that he has no reason to make any public charges against them, the Jews. And then Paul attempts to preach the gospel to the Jews, to talk about the hope of Israel being the reason for his imprisonment. Now, verse 21, they replied, "We have not received any letters from Judea concerning you, and none of our people who have come from there has reported or said anything bad about you. But we want to hear what your views are, for we know that people everywhere are talking against this sect." They arranged to meet Paul on a certain day and came in even larger numbers to the place where he was staying. He witnessed to them from morning till evening, explaining about the kingdom of God. And from the law of Moses and from the prophets, he tried to persuade them about Jesus. Some were convinced by what he said, but others would not believe. This happens all the time. Some people that we talk to about Jesus are convinced, and some are not. It's like the parable of the sower. You sow the seed, and then you let God take care of the harvest. All right. Verse 25. They disagreed among themselves and began to leave after Paul made this final statement. The Holy Spirit spoke the truth to your ancestors when he said through Isaiah the prophet, "Go to this people and say, you will be ever hearing but never understanding. You will be ever seeing but never perceiving. For this people's heart has become calloused. They hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn, and I would heal them. Therefore, I want you to know that God's salvation has been sent to the Gentiles, and they will listen." After he said this, the Jews left, arguing vigorously among themselves, not arguing, interestingly enough, with Paul. They were arguing amongst themselves. For 2 whole years, Paul stayed there in his own rented house and welcomed all who came to see him. He proclaimed the kingdom of God and taught about the Lord Jesus Christ with all boldness and without hindrances. Now, after, I want to do a little epilogue about Paul's life here, and then we will be done. Nero was emperor when Paul was imprisoned here in Rome. Luke never really tells us anything about his trial in front of Caesar. We don't know. But a man named Afrianus Burrus was advisor to Nero from AD 54 to AD 63. And, all these numbers are going to be approximate. Paul was said to be imprisoned between 60 and 62. So there was another advisor to Nero that came along around AD 63. That was after Paul was gone from prison. His name was, I believe it's Tigellinus. And he was said to be very brutal and cruel. And it was when he was advisor to Nero that it is said that Paul was beheaded around AD 68. But during the 2 years that Paul is in this house, he writes some prison epistles. And he wrote Philippians, Ephesians, Colossians, and Philemon from there. And he had many visitors and fellow prisoners. Timothy was with him. Also Luke, Aristarchus, John Mark, Epaphras, Justus, and Demas. He met Onesimus and converted him while he was in prison. Epaphroditus visited him with a gift from Philippi. Tychicus took letters from Paul to Ephesus. He also took the letters from Paul to Colossae and Philemon. Paul was on friendly terms with both the Augustan band of officers and the Praetorian Guard. Now, the Augustan band of officers were the same regiment as the imperial regiment that Julius was from. You remember Julius? He was the centurion on the ship with Paul, who brought him to Rome. All right, and also during this time, Luke wrote the book of Acts. Now, then, around AD 62, somewhere, AD 62, 63, Paul was released from his house prison. And he wrote 1 Timothy and Titus during this time. And also during this time, he went back and visited a lot of the churches that he planted. Titus and 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy talks about him visiting Crete, where he left Titus. It talked about him visiting churches in Macedonia and going to Troas and Miletus. Miletus is where Trophimus got sick. He left Timothy in Ephesus, and then he met some of his helpers at Nicopolis. Now, around AD 64, I'm sure you've heard of the burning of Rome. I'm not going to get into that. But after Rome burning is when the persecution of the Christians began in earnest. Then around sometime after that, maybe 66, 67, Paul was arrested again and imprisoned in Rome. Now, here is the Mamertinum prison in Rome. Now, it didn't look like this back then. That this was built after Paul was in prison here. Now, this says Prigioni de whatever it says Baptistole Pietro e Paolo. Forgive my Italian, but it's the prison where St. Paul and St. Peter were. And at one time, both of them were there. I don't know if they were there at the same time, but it is said that they both spent time in this prison. And then here is an altar that was built in a dungeon. You notice the upside down cross because it's said that Peter was crucified, and he wanted to be crucified upside down because he did not want to be crucified the same way Christ was. And then here is another picture of the dungeon part at this prison. So not probably as nice a place as he had whenever he was in prison in the house. Paul was thought to have been arrested at Nicopolis, chained in a prison, treated like a criminal. He wrote 2 Timothy and asked Timothy to bring him his cloak before winter, so it was cold. He was forsaken by believers in Rome. He was forsaken by Demas. He was ministered to by the family of Onesiphorus. He longed for Timothy and Mark to visit him, and he knew the end was coming. And it is said that he was beheaded at Rome. And he was not crucified like Peter was, because he was a Roman citizen, and Roman citizens were not crucified. And although we are leaving on a sad note, I do want you to remember something that Paul said. For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. Paul went through so many storms in life, but he was able to encourage us, encourage Christians back then, and encourage Christians today even through his words. And I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to teach you about Acts and the journey of the early Christians through this time in our church history. Thank you very much.